All right, welcome guys. Bonus material for lecture 8 on actors, institutions and path dependencies. As I said in that lecture, this bonus material is all about inclusive and extractive institutions, which is a conceptual framework from Darren Acemoglu and Robinson. What's Robinson's first name? It's a good question. But anyway, so Acemoglu and Robinson, particularly in their book Why Nations Fail, and then they have kind of extensions to the framework in their other book that came later, The Narrow Corridor. Their work builds on some work from Elinor Ostrom, which we talked about in the week on sociology and psychology, but even more so on the work of Douglas North, who I think also won the Nobel Prize for Economics, but if he didn't, he was still very well regarded among economists, and he kind of really pioneered this idea that institutions of political economy really determine a lot of the things that economists care about, and so we need to look at structures, not just individual behavior. All right, so let's get into it, see what we got. Okay, so a little preamble maybe. This is more of a lecture on economic development rather than on public policy, but it shouldn't be too hard for you to see the links across from the kind of big picture political economy story I'm going to tell to public policy, particularly in developing countries. The themes that I'm going to highlight definitely should make it clear how institutions determine a lot of policy outcomes. More broadly than that, I just think this work by Acemoglu and Robinson is some of the most important stuff done this century by anyone. It's been a pretty short century so far, but I still think this work is almost certainly going to win a Nobel Prize in economics at some point. And I just want to teach you about it. It's relevant to the course. It's not that relevant. That's why it's in bonus material, but it is something I'd like people to know. So I'm going to take this opportunity to pass on this information. All right. So let's kind of introduce the high level framework that Acemoglu and Robinson use, and then we'll work from there on kind of filling out this picture in a bit more detail. So the basic idea in their book, and it's a very simple idea that they then illustrate with like 60 case studies, some of which are a chapter long, because this is a very, very hard topic to study in a quantitative way. So you really have to do it through case studies, a lot of which is historical analysis. So the basic idea is that you have two types of institutions. You have political institutions and economic institutions. They are co-determined in a lot of ways. And these institutions can be either inclusive, which means that people are empowered by these institutions to participate in politics or the economy, or they can be extractive, which means that the people who have economic and political power are able to use that power to hoard economic and political opportunities for themselves and thereby exploit other people and extract from them, particularly extract money. So some examples of extractive institutions include a lack of law and order, which allows you to get things through violence, insecure property rights, which allows things to be stolen in a variety of ways, but slavery, the creation of property rights is often a way to extract resources. We'll talk about that a bit later. Entry barriers, so ways to prevent people from coming in and competing with you in a market in which you already have dominance. We'll look at some examples of that later, including licensing. Non-level playing fields, which are designed by and for the elite. And we're seeing something like that maybe playing out right now in artificial intelligence. And then, in contrast, you have inclusive institutions, things that allow everyone to participate. Property rights and contract law are the main ones emphasized by economics, so they are the most important inclusive economic institutions. Open competition and state support for market participation. So this is one of the main arguments for state provision of education, health, public transport, this sort of stuff, is that it allows people to participate in the economy and then makes that economy more dynamic. Now over on the right, I've got this picture that sets up this kind of grid of whether your economic institutions are inclusive or extractive and whether your political institutions are extractive or inclusive. And then so if you have both inclusive, then you've got the bubble here populated with some of the countries that this applies to. So generally speaking, the United States, Western Europe, and the Asian tiger economies. So what was that? Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, if I'm remembering correctly. And then you have the tiger cubs, which is Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam. And I can't remember what the fourth one is. It's not the Philippines. Anyway, so those are the kind of the first most developed nations, the first nations to develop economically in Asia, particularly post-World War II. I guess China is probably one of the tiger cubs. So these are all places that have inclusive political institutions, so things like democracy and stuff we'll talk about in a moment, and inclusive economic institutions like the ones we have here. And the key point is that when you have both of these types of institutions, they tend to create a self-reinforcing cycle. Now, that is very much under strain in the United States at the moment, in part because political institutions in particular have become much less inclusive in America. They've really excluded poorer people, especially in recent years. And I think that's broadly true of economic institutions as well, because of the lack of state support for health, education, etc. Over on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have countries that have both extractive political and economic institutions. And we don't see heaps of these today, but there are a lot of so-called failed states where basically you don't have a state to speak of. You have a lot of different powerful factions. And so no group is able to exercise a monopoly over violence. So you should know this from your first year political theory courses. There is no Leviathan. And as a result of there being no Leviathan, there tends to be kind of constant warfare, either hot, cold, small scale, large scale between these different powerful groups. And in order to fund that warfare, they often engage in extractive behaviors. So classic examples of this would be the failed states of sub-Saharan Africa, like Mali. Mali, am I saying that right? Or Malawi? Anyway, I have to confess that I'm not that familiar with what's going on in Africa, but there are a large number of states through the coup belt in particular at the moment that are struggling to kind of establish basic rule of law. The other kind of prominent examples are the kind of kleptocratic autocracies that characterize Central Asia and the Stans and Russia. So Russia is very much a kleptocracy. The economy and politics are structured to enrich a small collection of elites at the expense of general citizens. Over on the extractive political institutions, but relatively inclusive economic institutions, I think probably the preeminent example here is China. So political institutions in China are not inclusive. I think it would be very difficult to make the case that they are. But economic institutions, while sometimes extractive, certainly relative to the late 70s, are way more inclusive than they used to be. You've got property rights, contract law, much more open competition, very good provision, I would say, of state support for market participation, relative to China's level of development at least. And so you've seen tremendous growth in China and much more widespread growth. So elite people have gotten super crazy rich over the last few decades, but that's partially for this quite complicated reason that in the early stages of development, capital is very scarce. And so the returns to capital are very high. And so the people that control capital have gotten very wealthy. It just so happens that those people tend to also have been already quite politically powerful in the late 70s. But let's not get into a whole story about China. The idea here is that China is an example of a place with relatively extractive political institutions. I guess the ability of the state to impose its will in Xinjiang would be an example, but relatively inclusive economic institutions. And you can still get quite good outcomes under those kind of settings. Then you have examples of places that have extractive economic institutions, but inclusive political institutions. And I think Botswana, immediately after it gained independence from its colonists, is an example of this. So the colonists had set up very extractive economic institutions, but the post-colonial independence leadership was highly benevolent, just kind of miraculously, really. And they set about creating quite inclusive political institutions. And the key question for these two boxes here, Botswana and China, is whether they move towards inclusive institutions on both fronts over time, or whether they regress down to this box here, right? So Botswana very much is converging really quite rapidly, quite hearteningly towards having inclusive economic and political institutions. China was until Xi Jinping, and I think even in the early years of Xi Jinping, there was quite a lot of hope and optimism about China, particularly with some of the early reforms to intellectual property. The Belt and Road Initiative was unexpected, but not necessarily bad from the beginning. But I think over the last 10 years, and especially since Xi kind of declared himself ruler for life, there's been much more concern about backsliding in China. I guess one of the key things with China is that as Xi Jinping was coming to power, the CCP was experimenting with greater political liberalization at the local level. And in particular, you could run for local political offices as an independent. You weren't allowed to start alternate political parties to the Chinese Communist Party, but you were allowed to be an independent. And that sort of stuff has been cracked down on, and generally the kind of democratization of local government has been slowed dramatically relative to the pace at which it was happening before Xi took over. All right, so this is that kind of idea about the paths that you can take. So you can move towards, let's just talk about this in a bit of detail. I've got to remind myself how I wanted to move through this slide. All right, so here we're talking mostly about political institutions alone, and political institutions tend to determine the pathway of economic institutions. And the key things in political institutions, according to Acemoglu and Robinson, is the distribution of power, whether that is narrow, so only a few people have power, or broad, whether everyone is given some measure of power. And then how that relates to the development of the state as an entity. So you can have the lack of a state, or you can have political centralization. So examples of pluralism, which is this kind of broad distribution of power, tend to have a lot of constraints on elites, which we'll talk about in a follow-up slide, and they tend to have rule of law, not rule by law. So the difference between the two is that in rule of law, everyone is subject to the law in the same way. In rule by law, the elites use the law to further their ends, and they are not affected by the law in the same way as everyone else. There tends to be a different kind of legal system for elites, one that is often highly corrupt. In terms of centralization, institutions, what you tend to see under centralized regimes is a monopoly on violence by the state. So we don't have that issue with roving warlords competing against each other. The state has the capacity to regulate economic activity in its domain. It has the capacity to impose taxes, and as a result of that, it also has the capacity to provide public goods. And you absolutely need some degree of political centralization, some degree of state building, as it's called, in development in order to see economic and political development, particularly economic development, and generally to see better human development outcomes. So let's explore that in a bit of detail. So in the early stages of development, you often have a narrow distribution of power, so a few elites hold a lot of the power, and the lack of a state. So we see that today in these, as I said, these African nations that are characterized by civil war, but historically we saw it kind of everywhere on the planet. So at times there would have been tribes or principalities or city-states eventually in Europe, but no one in those city-states had broad power. So the reason why Athens and Athenian democracy in the Hellenic period is so famous is because it was such an outlier. Typically you had kings, princes, warlords, whatever it might be. So a narrow distribution of power and really not much of a state. So the state couldn't really level taxes historically, and the taxes that it did levy were almost always just for the army, for protection or for imperialism. And because these states were so small, they were constantly in conflict with other powerful groups, other small states, typically. But over time in Europe, as exemplified by England over the course of, the period from about, 600 AD through to about 1700 AD and thereafter, you had general centralization. So the distribution of power became broader, but the state became more centralized. So the state developed the capacity for things like installing sewerage in London in the Victorian period, while also developing more and more democracy in England. In comparison, though, you can have a path towards less broadening of political power, but more political centralization. And this is what you have seen in a lot of Asian nations in particular, but also historically Prussia and Turkey up until Ataturk, where you had centralization of power in terms of the state's capacity to do all sorts of stuff, regulate trade, create massive infrastructure works like the Chinese high-speed rail network. So a lot of centralization of political power and a lot of centralization of state capacity, growth in state capacity, but not a distribution of power. And then what you tend to get as a result of that is then a lot of extractive economic institutions. And I think we are actually seeing some of that today in America. The early stages of it, but it could be accelerated a lot if Trump wins the next election. It's very rare to see broad-based distribution of power with the lack of a state. This is the kind of thing you get in like prehistory, when tribes were the kind of only real unit of organization and tribes would often fight against each other. But in those kind of settings, you did typically get, occasionally at least, a lot of tribes uniting under one strong leader. And Mongol raiders is kind of the classic example of that. So Mongolia was historically characterized by a lot of different tribes, but they would occasionally all be unified under one strong leader. If they aren't so unified, then you get this broad-based distribution of power, lack of a state. We see very few examples of that today. All right. So what are some examples of how power can be distributed? A few of the key institutions here would be things like the separation of powers, which is kind of the secret sauce core institution of Western liberal democracies, so separation between the courts, the executive, and the legislature, and historically also separating those things out from the church. And I think as in a lot of countries, there is not a separation in particular between the courts and the legislature, at least for some things. So in China, for example, while the courts are separate from the state when it comes to a lot of small-time economic things like, parking fines, setting up your small business, enforcing contracts, this sort of stuff, the courts are not separate from the state when it comes to matters of sort of, how would I put it, kind of political cohesion or anything to do with the CCP's political agenda. Then the CCP works very hand in fist, as it were, with the courts. Another key example of the distribution of power is that the parliament, and particularly the parliament in terms of being composed of elected representatives, is based on constituencies, not on patronage. So in some states that are nominally democratic, the ability to get into parliament in those states is governed by how well you are connected to people who have a lot of power, not by how well you represent the people of the region you are from. And you are not kind of brought up into power by the people of the region you are from, but you're instead kind of parachuted into a constituency from the centre. Another really obvious one, going back to Abe Lincoln, democracy is government by the people, of the people, for the people, is that we want the principle of one person, one vote. It's also important that the powerful positions in the state, which includes the bureaucracy, is appointed meritocratically, not on the basis of family connections or other kind of access to insiders, other kind of processes that can be easily corrupted. Unfortunately, meritocracy itself can easily be corrupted, and I think that is what we are seeing again in the United States at the moment and elsewhere. Typically, we want to see devolution, so that's a big topic in UK public policy at the moment, is that you don't want decisions that affect regions to be determined by the centre. The centre should be making decisions for the country as a whole, and decisions that only affect certain parts of the country should ideally be left to people in those parts of the country. In Christian doctrine, this is called the principle of subsidiarity. And it's basically the idea that power should be devolved to the lowest scale possible, basically, in order to ensure that local knowledge informs those kind of decisions. Okay. What do I mean by constraints on elites? So if I'm going through this list of things here from political institutions. We've talked about distribution of power, and then there's constraints on elites. The key one here is that really the law should apply to elites the same way that it applies to everyone else. If elites have their own laws, then this is what we call rule by law, not rule of law. So the law is used as an instrument by powerful people to further their ends, not as an institution by society to ensure collective norms. Especially problematic is when elites can use the state to cover up their crimes and prosecute their personal agendas because they have no constraints under the law. So two prominent examples of this recently were the murder of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi Secret Service agents when he went into a Saudi embassy. A lot of evidence emerged in the wake of that his assassination really did seem to have been ordered by the Crown Prince, the leader of Saudi Arabia, but he denied all the allegations, and then there was a kind of very performative trial of a bunch of Secret Service people, quite senior in many cases in Saudi Arabia, who ended up being executed. So there was, in a sense, some accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but it didn't seem to be accountable of the person who actually ordered the murder. And in fact, he used the law, the kind of performance of the execution of these people, to absolve himself of any kind of blame for this event, which seems quite perverse, really. And then the other prominent case from a few years ago now is this campaign about where is Peng Shuai, who is a very prominent Chinese tennis player, and she kind of disappeared from public life for several weeks after accusing a very high-ranking member of the Chinese Communist Party of quite intense sexual harassment. She kind of seemed to cop a lot of crap for that, a lot of weird, creepy, totalitarian stuff where she was disappeared and then was issuing these kind of weird, seemingly ghost-written, inauthentic statements, but not kind of doing so on camera, not doing so in a relaxed manner. And meanwhile, this guy who she'd accused of impropriety was just kind of going about his business. And this again seems to be a situation where elites can kind of do whatever they want, while it's kind of one rule for me and a different rule for thee. And of course, we do see this kind of thing in developed countries as well as a result of corruption. Well, not to say developed, in other countries, in Western countries, in liberal countries, we see plenty of this sort of behavior. But at least, when Donald Trump tries to do really horrible things, he's currently indicted on 91 counts of criminal charges in the United States, and he's going through the courts. All right, let's look at some examples of extractive and inclusive institutions just to finish off this little bonus lecture. So I want to talk in a bit more detail about patronage because it's something that you see all over the place. It's typically a bit more hidden in developed countries, but I will try to give examples from developed countries. So patronage is essentially where you give economic opportunities or rents to clients in order to maintain your political power. So it's kind of a quid pro quo. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. I will give you economic opportunities if you give me political power, and vice versa. Typically, the way patronage works is that you look for ways to easily create certain rents. So the classic cases in developing countries is that you monopolize things like utilities, so electricity, water, sewage, etc., and you monopolize big infrastructure projects like mining and big natural resource assets like land. Once you've monopolized them through some kind of legal architecture, you then give the rights to exploit those resources or to charge people for electricity, for example, to people who are politically connected to you. This is standard kleptocratic behavior. It's very much how Russia operates. But there are other ways to create these sort of rents. So a very classic example is import quotas, which is a law where in order to import a certain product, you need to get a license from the government. And then that gives you a monopoly over that product, whereas instead anyone could be allowed to import it, and then the various importers would compete to offer that imported good at lower prices to people domestically, and domestic producers of that good could also turn up and start creating it. So anytime you're kind of limiting competition like this, limiting open competition, you are creating rents, and you're probably involved in either simple corruption or something even more pernicious like patronage politics. A very famous example of this is Tunisia from 1987 to 2011, where Ben Ali used this kind of foreign investment regime very extensively to create regimes for his family businesses and enrich his family, consolidate his political power. But looking at an example from a developed country, could turn to my home country of Australia, where land is very much related to patronage politics. So Australia has an insane real estate market, one of the world's most explosive casino-like real estate markets, very, very high real estate prices. Everyone is completely obsessed with real estate in Australia, and prices have historically been very high and just never seem to come down. They just keep growing really fast. And you'd think that in this kind of circumstance, one way to drop the price of real estate would be to release more supply of real estate. Part of the reason why that doesn't happen is because when the government releases what's called greenfield land for development, so completely sort of natural land that no one has ever built on before, or that's only ever been farms or something like that, they don't put anything on that release that requires the developers to build immediately. So what the developers then do is land banking, which means that they have the right to develop on certain land, but they will develop that land and sell the houses on that land when it is optimal for them to do so in terms of the management of demand and supply, and thus the price. So if they developed all of that land immediately and sold all the apartments on it, that would actually collapse the price because there'd be a spike in supply, and that wouldn't be profit maximizing for those developers, but it would be welfare maximizing for citizens who are looking to buy cheaper housing. Now, part of the reason why the government doesn't engage in this very, very obvious policy tweak to make things better is because the real estate lobby in Australia is a very substantial donor to the Liberal Party, and the construction worker union is also a very substantial donor to the Labor Party. And so there is kind of no party in this space who has a particularly strong incentive to massively improve the supply in the short term of housing. You might think that, well, wouldn't creating more housing supply be good for construction workers? Yes, but it would not be good for insider construction workers. So the construction workers who have the most influence and power want preferential access to the best paying jobs. If you had a spike in supply, you would probably have a shortage of labor workers, and so you would have to bring in migrants, or you would otherwise have to bring in some other workers from outside the kind of insider bubble, so the insiders wouldn't benefit as much as they would otherwise. Another example of rent seeking that's very widespread but not as pernicious as the kind of patronage stuff that I had on the previous slide is licensing. So, for example, occupational licensing, like that. In order to work as a plumber, you need to have a license to be a plumber. In order to work as a hairdresser or a massage therapist or a bricklayer, extremely low-skilled jobs, as a tennis coach, you need to get licenses. Now, sometimes these licensing organizations can be voluntary. So, like, you can work as a tennis coach legally in Australia without being licensed to be a tennis coach. But you might want to get licensed just to convince your clients that you know what you're talking about, that someone has given you the stamp of authority. But in other cases, it's actually legally enforced that you must be licensed. I've got a humorous cartoon on the Moodle from Koala Man, which is kind of like the Rick and Morty of Australia, with a scene of kind of this sort of behaviour among tradespeople in Australia, which is sort of infamous in Australia. And I think they do a good representation of it, so have a look. But the basic idea is that some organisation is empowered to exclude people from being able to do these jobs. And as a result of that, the people who can do that job tend to get higher wages because there is a constriction of supply. And bosses can also use a lack of license on the part of a worker in order to pay them less money until they get licensed, even if they have all the skills to do that job totally fine. An alternate approach to this sort of thing is just to rely on kind of customer reviews. So if you go to a hairdresser and they're not licensed, but you can see that the person whose hair they're cutting, they're just doing a shit job of it, or there's a bunch of Google reviews of this place saying that they don't do a good job, then you just won't go there. Now that means that a couple of people have to get burned before word spreads that this person doesn't know what they're doing, but it might be just as effective. One of the really complicated cases for licensing is with doctors. So in America in particular, doctors have long resisted the empowerment of kind of advanced nurses, like highly qualified nurses, to do a bunch of stuff that has historically been done by doctors. That both suppresses the wages of those nurses and inflates the wages of doctors. It also constricts the supply of those services, which means that it's harder for people to get those services on the cheap. At the same time, medical licensing is something where we want to be careful that people do know what they're doing. So here there's a kind of complex game to be played about who issues these licenses and whether it is the case that someone with that nurse level of training is capable of doing it. Generally, from what I've read, I think the nurses are capable of doing it. And I think generally we should be very skeptical about the views of insiders in these kind of cases. Right, let's go to another example of extractive institutions. This is more just a kind of, it's not like a class of extractive institutions, it's just a straightforward example. So during COVID in the UK, the government created this fast track for contracts. So the government needed to buy tons of stuff during COVID, like ventilators and that sort of thing. They needed to get their hands on those things quickly. And so they couldn't, in their opinion, go through standard procurement protocols for the government to ensure that the government wasn't wasting taxpayer money on bullshit. So they created this fast track that allowed them to bypass a lot of those things, particularly to skip a lot of the scrutiny that comes with standard procurement protocols. And there's been a lot of extensive investigations of this process, particularly this one by the New York Times that I've linked here, which shows that about half of the $22 billion that was spent through this fast track system went to companies with political connections, no prior experience in providing these goods, or histories of controversy, but they still had the political connections. So it really seems like a case where the Tory government, and I'm sure that Labor would have probably done the same thing if they were in power. People are dodgy, but this Tory government is particularly corrupt. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't give my political opinions in class, but I feel like corruption really gets my shackles up. So yeah, that like half of this money was basically spent on corrupt things. So people who had connections to the Tories got rewarded for those connections, and then they probably went on to donate some of that money back to Tory party political campaigns. All right. Another, a general class of extractive institutions is basically the socialization of costs and privatization of gains. One example of this is where infrastructure is purpose-built for private industry by public money. It's very common in Australia, very common in America. I'm not so sure about the United Kingdom, partially because a lot of the time in Australia and the United States, private industry wants to do something very far away from any kind of existing development, whereas in Europe, everywhere's developed, so it's very rare to do something like that. So I've got this example where in Australia, a gas company wants to build a gas mining operation and they need roads and railway to access that. And so the government then spends about 200 million Australian dollars, which is about 100,000 British pounds, on building this road that basically only this company is going to use. And if only the company is going to use it, then the company should pay for it, because it's not in the public interest. It's not going to benefit the general public. So why is the general public paying for it? And this sort of thing is fairly endemic. And oftentimes you hear just like really brazen statements from politicians like, oh, well, this project wouldn't be viable if we didn't build this road, and the state needs the investment. I mean, the state absolutely does not need the investment. The state needs you to spend that money on something that people are going to use, not something that this private company is going to use. If the private company's project is not viable without a bunch of state money, then it's not viable. This is essentially a subsidy to people with political connections, and it's definitely an example of extraction. All right, what about inclusive institutions then? Let's look at something a bit more hopeful. So I mentioned that the most important inclusive institution is property rights. I know that Marxists might find that a bit spicy, I don't want to get into a huge debate about Marxism, but the idea that we can function without property rights, I think, is like straightforwardly disproven by the historical record. The basic idea with property rights is just that if you go to a bunch of effort to make something, then you should keep it. Right? Obviously, there's taxation and things like that, but the basic premise is that if you work, you get to keep the fruits of your labor. Oftentimes, property rights can be used in reverse and become an extractive institution. So in Cambodia, for example, there are a lot of forestry areas where indigenous people live and live off the land and sustainably manage a lot of those forests and have done so for centuries. And then the government in Phnom Penh, with no connection to those regions, creates property rights in the national register in Phnom Penh, gives those rights to various developers, and then those developers go and log that forest because that allows them to make a bunch of money. That is the use of property rights for extraction. That's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about, say, getting rid of slavery so that you get paid for the work that you do, or you get to keep the fruits of your labor. And slavery was not just confined to kind of black slavery through the colonial period. Prior to that, and I think concurrently to that in large parts of Europe like Russia, you had serfdom, which was essentially a situation where peasants were allocated to certain aristocrats and couldn't leave, and they were forced to work for those aristocrats at much less than the sort of prevailing market wage. I think what you have in China today, which is the hukou laws, which is essentially similar to serfdom in that you are registered to a particular part of the country. You don't have to work there. You can migrate somewhere else to work. But if you migrate somewhere else to work, you have lower rights there. So often you are allowed to be paid a lower wage, and you don't have access to schools there for your kids. You don't have access to healthcare there for yourself, etc. Hukou is a much weaker form of an extractive institution relative to serfdom. Hukou is often justified on the grounds that it prevented just kind of unsustainable migration from the countryside into urban areas historically, allowed the smoothing of urban development, prevented the emergence of slums, this kind of stuff. I don't have space here to evaluate whether that's true or not. I think it's a complex situation. All right. Another example of an inclusive institution, and here we come back to this idea that we need to give people access to the economy, and that one of the main ways we do that is by providing education, health, public infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure. And one way that we can undermine this is by financing a lot of these public goods, or publicly provided goods, I should say, through local taxation rather than through federal or national level taxation. Unfortunately, a lot of this in the US at least is funded through local sources. And what that means is that poorer neighborhoods generate less tax revenue, which means that their schools, hospitals, infrastructure has less money with which to be financed. So the schools and health and etc. tends to then be of a lower quality, which means that those people have a harder time getting access to the economy. In contrast, the richer neighborhoods have more money to spend on these things. Now, if you instead collect all the tax revenue at the federal level, so at the nation, and then the nation looks around and distributes that tax revenue on a needs basis, like this place is very deprived, so we need to spend more money there to make sure that their standard of education and health is on par with elsewhere in the country, then you're much more likely to get equal access to the economy. All right, and then the final, most important, I guess, inclusive institution after property taxes, I guess, is just generally kind of law enforcement, investigation, and particularly law enforcement, not of the kind of law that you see on Law and Order or on Propaganda, these kind of reality TV law shows like Border Force, but rather white collar crime, which is actually where a lot of the corruption happens and where a lot of the big money is stolen from people. We need things like anti-corruption commissions, anti-corruption inquiries, deep investigations into the nexus of crime and the state. Things like the car wash investigations in Brazil, which you should Google if you're interested in this sort of thing. Laws to protect whistleblowers, so people in organizations who see corrupt or criminal behavior going on and report it need to be protected from claims that they revealed state secrets in doing that, and so they have to go to jail, this kind of stuff. One big innovation in this space over the last, say, 30 years has been the advent of freedom of information requests. So any citizen can write to the government and say, I want all documents that the government has produced relating to these things. And freedom of information requests are quite complicated, but they do allow citizens to get access to government documents. And then we also have things like Senate estimates, which the House of Lords also does in the UK, but basically where the House of Review in a political system can launch its own inquiries and particularly hold the bureaucracy to account. So where the lower house tends to debate legislation, a lot of the job of the upper house is to investigate the government's own internal processes to make sure that they are working in the public interest. All right, well, I hope that was an interesting discussion of inclusive and extractive institutions. If you found this stuff thought-provoking, interesting, I highly, highly recommend reading Why Nations Fail. It's quite long, but very rewarding. And I will catch you guys in the next lecture.